was like Hollywood resistance to that movie. Like people didn't like that you were making it. It seemed like.
Yeah, there was a lot of opposition to it.
Mel Gibson did not speak casually when he reflected on the Passion of the Christ. In a recent conversation that sent quiet shockwaves through the internet, Gibson revealed something unsettling, something he had warned about long before the cameras ever rolled. When Joe Rogan revisited the story of Gibson and Jim Caviezel, the man who portrayed Jesus, the discussion took an unexpected turn. It wasn't about box office numbers or cinematic technique. It was about cost. A personal cost few people are willing to pay. Hollywood is often described as dazzling, powerful, and endlessly seductive. But beneath that polished surface lies a harsher truth, one rarely spoken out loud. And when Joe Rogan finally said it, even he seemed surprised by how undeniable it sounded. Being openly Christian in Hollywood can cost you everything. That admission didn't come lightly. Rogan is known for pushing boundaries, for questioning narratives others avoid. His podcast often explores the unseen machinery behind fame and influence. Yet when the topic shifted to Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel, the creative force and the face behind the Passion of the Christ, Rogan didn't hedge his words. He acknowledged what many insiders whisper, but few publicly confirm. Faith in Hollywood is not merely unpopular. It is dangerous to a career. Roles disappear. Reputations are quietly undermined. Doors close without explanation. And still, some choose to walk that path.
So he stepped on a bunch of landmines, but yeah, it did have a profound effect on him.
Listening to Jim Caviezel speak about his experience left a lasting impression on Rogan. Gibson, reflecting on Caviezel's transformation during filming, described something he had never witnessed before.
He emptied himself out and he meditated and he let Christ in.
This wasn't method acting. This wasn't performance. Caviezel, Gibson said, wasn't pretending to surrender. He was surrendering. At times, Gibson admitted, he stepped back entirely, watching something unfold that went beyond filmmaking. Rogan put it plainly, this wasn't just a movie. It was doing something else. It was strengthening people's faith. That, ironically, is precisely what made it so controversial. The Passion of the Christ became a global phenomenon, defying every prediction made by Hollywood executives. Audiences showed up in massive numbers. Viewers wept. Conversations ignited across cultures and continents. Yet inside the industry, the film was often dismissed, minimized, or treated with visible discomfort. Its success exposed a contradiction Hollywood wasn't prepared to face. And behind the scenes, something darker was unfolding. Strange incidents, intense emotional strain, moments that felt, even to hardened professionals, deeply unsettling. At the center of it all was a warning Mel Gibson had issued early on, one that would permanently mark everyone involved. What did Gibson witness during production? Why did he caution actors about portraying Jesus? And how did that warning reshape the life of the man who accepted the role? To understand the weight of that moment, you have to go back to the early 2000s, when making a biblical film was almost unthinkable in Hollywood. Studio after studio rejected Gibson's vision. Some executives doubted the commercial viability of a film centered on Christ's crucifixion. Others feared backlash, controversy, association. The message was clear. This story was too risky. So Gibson did something nearly unheard of. He funded the film himself. He risked millions of his own money, knowing full well that failure could end his career as a filmmaker. But he pressed forward, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. Ironically, when Gibson first arrived in Hollywood years earlier.
When I came over here, I was in my mid-20s.
He had no grand plan. He was a kid from Australia, uncertain whether acting would even work out. Suddenly, he found himself inside the most powerful entertainment industry in the world, a place governed by unspoken rules and silent hierarchies.
It is. The system is completely based on money. Yeah. The studio system.
He later described those early years as both mesmerizing and unsettling. Hollywood felt like a foreign country. He said, one where everyone else knew the language, but no one bothered to teach it to you. Success came quickly, but so did unease. As his fame grew, so did his awareness of the industry's shadows. The applause was loud. The rewards were real. Yet Gibson couldn't escape the sense that something fundamental was missing. Beneath the glamour was a system driven almost entirely by money, where storytelling was often secondary to control, influence, and profit. When Gibson transitioned from actor to filmmaker, that realization became impossible to ignore. He saw how stories were shaped, softened, or silenced. He learned which subjects were encouraged and which were quietly discouraged. And then he chose the one story Hollywood least wanted told. That decision would cost him. It would cost Jim Caviezel even more. But neither man walked away, because once you understand the price of faith, the only real question left is whether truth is worth paying for. And for some, no matter the backlash, the answer remains yes. In Hollywood, talent is admired, but profit is worshipped. Mel Gibson learned this lesson early, and he learned it the hard way. The studio system, he discovered, was never just about making films. It was about leverage, about favors quietly exchanged, about loyalty that lasted only as long as it remained useful. Decisions were made behind closed doors, promises dissolved without explanation. People who smiled at you in public could quietly work against you in private. Over time, Mel came to understand something essential. Resentment had no place in survival. If you carried every betrayal with you, the industry would consume you whole. It's not personal, he once explained. They don't wake up trying to hurt you. It's just how the system functions. But knowing that didn't make it easier. By the time Gibson had cemented his status as one of Hollywood's most powerful figures, he had also become acutely aware of its shadow side. Beneath the red carpets and standing ovations lay a culture built on manipulation and quiet humiliation. Praise was often temporary, loyalty was conditional, and advancement frequently came at someone else's expense. For Mel, this wasn't just an abstract reality, it became a deeply personal struggle. He described Hollywood as a strange, almost surreal place, where nothing was ever quite what it appeared to be. Like walking into a room where everyone else shared a secret you were never told. Like the old Western films, he said, where a stranger enters a saloon and the entire room falls silent. That sense of isolation followed him. At times, he wondered if he was imagining it, if the unease, the paranoia, the feeling of unseen forces at work were all in his head. But as the years passed, experience confirmed his fears. Some of the darkest suspicions he carried turned out to be true. This place will humiliate you, Gibson once admitted, but it can also humble you. It keeps testing you, trying to break you down, and those walls it pounds against, they're your own. That hard-earned clarity would shape the most controversial decision of his career. When Mel Gibson turned his attention to the final hours of Jesus Christ, it didn't begin as a pitch or a business strategy. It began as a question, one that refused to leave him alone. What did those last hours truly look like? That question became an obsession, not a cinematic curiosity, but something closer to a calling. Gibson didn't want symbolism. He didn't want abstraction. He wanted truth, raw, painful, unfiltered truth, the suffering, the brutality, the cost of sacrifice. And that was exactly what made Hollywood recoil. Executives wanted safety, familiar formulas, stories that could be softened, reshaped, and sold without risk. A graphic, uncompromising portrayal of Christ's crucifixion did not fit the mold. One rejection followed another. Doors closed. Support evaporated. Still, Gibson refused to retreat. I knew the story had been told before, he said, but never like this. I wanted to go deeper. I wanted people to feel the weight of it. Instead of backing the project, the industry distanced itself. Then Mel found Jim Caviezel. From the beginning, Gibson sensed something different about him. Not just talent, but emptiness in the rarest sense. A willingness to step aside and let something greater take over. Gibson later said that Jim didn't just prepare for the role, he emptied himself for it. At the time, Caviezel was riding the momentum of a rising Hollywood star. Films like The Thin Red Line and The Count of Monte Cristo had positioned him for a long, prosperous career. His movies were successful. His future looked secure. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. After The Passion of the Christ, that trajectory vanished almost overnight. How does a career like that simply disappear before filming even began? Gibson made sure Jim understood the stakes. This was not a role to accept lightly. One day, Gibson pulled him aside and spoke with brutal honesty. No reassurance, no softening of words. If you take this role, Gibson told him, you may never work in this town again. This wasn't exaggeration. Gibson knew exactly how polarizing the film would be. He understood the scrutiny, the backlash, the quiet blacklisting that could follow. Playing Jesus Christ, especially in such an uncompromising portrayal, would place Caviezel directly in the crosshairs of Hollywood judgment. Many actors would have walked away. Jim didn't hesitate. His response was immediate, calm, and resolute. We all have to carry our crosses, he said. For Caviezel, this wasn't about career advancement. It wasn't about prestige or visibility. It was about obedience, about conviction, about saying yes to something that might cost him everything. He later explained it simply: to speak the truth, you have to be willing to give up your name, your reputation, even your life as you know it. Mel Gibson's warning wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. And as the years unfolded, it became clear just how accurate it was. When The Passion of the Christ finally reached theaters, its impact was immediate and impossible to ignore. The film exploded into global consciousness, becoming both a cultural landmark and a lightning rod for controversy. Supporters hailed it as fearless and reverent, a portrayal of Christ that refused to soften the truth. Critics, however, condemned it as excessive, divisive, even dangerous. For Jim Caviezel, the consequences arrived almost overnight. Hollywood did not debate quietly. It chose sides, and in doing so, it quietly turned its back on the man who had carried the film on his shoulders. Casting calls slowed, conversations stopped. Filmmakers who once saw him as a dependable leading man now viewed him as a liability, too associated with a story many in the industry wanted to distance themselves from. Yet Jim never expressed regret. Instead of retreating, he leaned further into his faith. He accepted what the role had changed in him and what it had taken from him. For Caviezel, the cost was not a surprise. It was part of the decision. When the film premiered in 2004, no one predicted what would happen next. Made on a relatively modest budget, The Passion of the Christ shattered expectations, earning more than $600 million worldwide. Audiences were shaken, churches were filled, conversations erupted across cultures and continents. But success did not translate into safety. The film didn't just divide viewers, it fractured Hollywood itself. While millions embraced Caviezel's portrayal of Jesus, the industry reacted with caution, even hostility. The same performance that moved audiences was now seen as a risk factor, and by association. Jim himself became controversial. He noticed the shift immediately. The phone rang less, invitations disappeared. He found himself standing outside the system he once seemed destined to dominate. Looking back, Jim said the change didn't trouble him. He had already accepted the possibility that portraying Christ might close doors permanently. Jesus is just as controversial now as he was 2,000 years ago, he said. That hasn't changed. Jim understood something many actors never have to confront. Playing Christ meant surrendering the future Hollywood had promised him, and he decided it was worth it. The film had drawn him closer to God, but further away from the industry's familiar path. Mel Gibson later reflected on what made Caviezel's performance different. He struggled to explain it, not because the words were complex, but because the experience defied technique. He did something I've never seen anyone else do, Gibson said. I believed it. I really believed it. He didn't try to perform. He emptied himself. He meditated. He let Christ in. That surrender changed Jim, not just as an actor, but as a human being. One moment during filming remains etched into Caviezel's memory. Picture it, a barren hill, more than 300 people standing in silence. The wind howls violently. Thick clouds press low against the sky. The air feels heavy, charged, and then, without warning, everything stops. The wind dies, sound disappears, time feels distorted, stretched thin, and suddenly, Jim felt himself detach. He later described the sensation as if he were outside his own body, watching from above, a moment so disorienting, so overwhelming, that it defied rational explanation. How does something like that happen on a film set? This was during one of the most intense scenes of The Passion of the Christ. What most viewers never realized was the sheer physical and spiritual toll Caviezel endured. The crucifixion scene was not a controlled illusion. Jim was hoisted onto a cross, exposed to the elements for hours at a time. The cold cut deep. The wind battered him relentlessly. His body trembled under exhaustion. Every minute was pain. But the suffering wasn't only physical. Jim wasn't simply acting. He knew he was stepping into something sacred, something weighty beyond cinema. That awareness pressed down on him as heavily as the cross itself. The wind was so strong, he recalled. The clouds were so low it felt like I could reach out and touch them, and the ground, it felt alive, like it was groaning. As the crew prepared, an unease spread across the set. Extras whispered to one another. Camera operators paused longer than necessary. Even seasoned professionals sensed something unusual in the air. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't calm either. It was as if everyone knew they were standing inside a moment that could not be reduced to film. Something was happening, and no one could quite explain it. What was happening on that hill no longer felt like acting. It felt real. The wind suddenly surged with such force that people struggled to stay on their feet. Equipment rattled. Voices were swallowed by the noise. Chaos pressed in from every direction. And yet, in the middle of it all, Jim Caviezel felt something utterly unexpected. A stillness so deep it cut through everything. Then, without warning, the sound vanished. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, Jim later recalled. Everything went quiet. What followed was something no one on set could explain, and something Jim would carry with him for the rest of his life. Hanging on the cross, surrounded by hundreds of people, Jim experienced something extraordinary. He described it plainly, without drama, because words could barely hold it. For a moment, he said, I left my body. I saw myself from behind. Seconds passed, or maybe much longer. Time no longer behaved the way it should. Jim was no longer just an actor portraying Jesus. He was no longer even fully present in his own body. It was as if his soul had stepped aside, granting him a vantage point he had never known. From above, he could see himself on the cross, motionless, exposed, just as Christ had been centuries earlier. He could see the crew moving below, the extras frozen in place, the entire scene unfolding beneath him. But what struck him most was not the image. It was the peace. Time didn't rush forward. It didn't slow painfully. It simply existed, calm, still, complete. It wasn't frightening, Jim said. It wasn't painful. It felt like I was being shown something far bigger than myself. Then, just as suddenly, he returned. The peace dissolved. Reality rushed back in. The cold burned his skin. His body ached. Exhaustion weighed down every breath. But despite the pain, Jim knew he had to continue. The scene wasn't finished, and neither was the journey. Years later, after surviving a near-death experience, Jim reflected on something Jesus once said, words that often confuse or unsettle people. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. At first glance, the statement feels harsh. How could the Prince of Peace speak of a sword? But Jim came to understand it not as violence, but as division, the kind that comes when truth demands a choice. That sword, he explained, cuts through illusion, through generational wounds, through cycles of brokenness that fracture families and lives. It separates what must be surrendered from what must remain. Jesus spoke often about true belonging. Whoever does the will of my Father, he said, is my brother and my sister. Jim learned firsthand what that meant. Following God, he discovered, sometimes means losing people you never imagined living without. It can cost friendships, careers, status, certainty. After portraying Jesus, Jim faced personal trials, professional setbacks, and relentless spiritual pressure. Some questioned his choices, others mocked his faith outright. Still, he did not waver. It's not easy, Jim admitted. Jesus never said it would be, but he promised it would be worth it. The sword Christ spoke of, Jim came to believe, is about cutting away what keeps us from God, especially the things we cling to most tightly. The false security, the approval, the identity we think we need. When Jim reflected on that moment of peace, both on the cross and later near death, one truth stood out above everything else. That peace wasn't connected to success, or comfort, or recognition. It wasn't tied to the people around him. It came from God alone. When you truly encounter God, Jim said, you realize nothing else matters. Not the pain, not the rejection, not even death. That realization gave him strength to endure, to speak, to continue forward even when the path narrowed and darkened. He no longer saw the passion of the Christ as a role he once played. He saw it as a calling, a moment when a story meant to be watched became a truth meant to be lived. And for Jim Caviezel, that calling was worth every cost. At its core, this story leaves us with a quiet but demanding truth. Following Jesus is always a choice. And it is rarely a comfortable one. It often asks for sacrifice, of reputation, security, and even the life we thought we were meant to live. Yet it is also the path that leads to something far deeper: peace, love, and eternal life. After everything Jim Caviezel experienced, on the cross during filming, in moments where life itself nearly slipped away, and through the trials that followed, he emerged with a message shaped not by success, but by surrender. A message rooted in love, sacrifice, and the peace that only God can give. Jim often returned to what he believed was Jesus' greatest command, to love, not when it is easy, not when it is safe, but when it costs something. That's why I obey him. Jim said, because love, in its truest form, is obedience for Jim. Loving like Christ was never sentimental. It meant letting go of pride, releasing grudges, surrendering comfort. Choosing faith when walking away would have been far easier. His journey, both on the cross and far beyond it, reveals something essential. Love is not merely an emotion. It is a decision to forgive, to trust, and to place God's will above our own. And through that decision, Jim discovered the peace Jesus promised. His life stands as a testimony, not to fame or endurance, but to faith, a reminder that no matter how heavy the cost, hope remains, peace remains, love remains. All are waiting for those willing to choose them. But this journey did not belong to Jim alone. For the cast and crew, the road was marked by resistance and hardship. Mel Gibson faced relentless criticism. Jim endured physical injuries, spiritual attacks, moments of doubt, and circumstances that seemed almost unreal. Still, they pressed forward because they believed the message was worth the sacrifice. The Passion of the Christ was never just a film. It became a movement. It reminded a restless world of the meaning of Christ's sacrifice and stirred countless hearts to reconsider their faith. For Mel Gibson and Jim Caviezel, it was a journey marked by conviction, resilience, and obedience. Their story reminds us of something simple, yet demanding. Following Christ is not always easy, but it is always worth it. So the question remains, if faced with the same cost, would you choose faith anyway? Because the story of Christ is not merely history. It is not confined to the past. It is the greatest story ever told, and it continues to ask something of each of us today.